We've spent the last few weeks in this series called Potential, all about dating. And that brings me to this one question. Do you know someone who throws common sense out the window when it comes to dating? Maybe that person is really careful when it comes to nearly every other area in their life, but for whatever reason, when it comes to dating, they want to be with someone so bad that they seem to settle for just about anybody. They overlook tons of red flags just so that they can date someone. Like we all have that one friend who says things like, I know they aren't perfect, and I know they've done bad stuff in the past, but they've changed. They really like me, and they would never do that to me. And in your head, you're like, hasn't every person that has dated them said the same thing? Sometimes it's easy for us to throw logic out the window because we want someone. And this can be funny and no big deal when friends do this and things work out, but other times it can be sad and people can end up hurt, and it's easy to think things like, why would you do that? Why would you settle? Don't you know how this is going to end? Don't you know how this always ends? In some ways, that's why people talk about regret so much when they talk about their dating life. It isn't that dating itself is bad, but sometimes the emotional entanglement of a relationship can make it really tough to see things clearly, to say the least. Or sometimes we want to be in a relationship so bad that it can be easy to make choices that we probably wouldn't have otherwise made. We can end up making choices that we regret because of the pressure that we feel. And what's interesting is that although we can see it when it's happening to other people, we often don't see it very well for ourselves. For example, you all know what a mirror does, but have you ever used a magnifying glass? It blows things up so that you can see them better. This is what we do sometimes. We use a magnifying glass with other people, but we refuse to use a mirror with ourselves. Maybe one of your friends dated someone who doesn't have the best reputation, and you thought that he or she was making a bad decision. But then you met someone who also didn't have a great reputation, but for different reasons. And because you felt like your situation was different, you were confident that you could handle whatever happened, or that you could change them maybe in some way. Maybe one of your friends had clear boundaries about what they would and wouldn't do physically in a relationship. And then they dated someone who pressured them to cross those lines. Not the best idea, right? But then you started dating someone and thought, well, maybe it's not really that big of a deal after all. Right? Feelings were hovering at around a 10 on a scale of 1 to 10, and you felt pressure from them or from yourself to do things that you thought you would never do. Maybe you had solid evidence that your friend was being cheated on, so you told them. But there was nothing you could do to get your friend to believe you. So they stayed with them, which was clearly a bad choice that wouldn't end well. But then you dated someone and got word that they cheated on you. And obviously, you're done with them, right? But you felt like it was better to be with someone who hurt you than to be by yourself. See, we all tend to have the same general rules when it comes to dating. We don't date a cheater or someone who brings you down or pulls you away from your values. But when we actually start developing feelings for someone, the pressure to make decisions gets a little higher, and those rules tend to become a little bit more flexible. We say things like, it's fine, it's just the way that it is. Or I can control this, it's not going to get out of hand. I can handle the consequences. And these views can bring us to a place where we make less than great decisions. We're going to look at a story from Scripture today that involves the most famous king in all of Israel, David, who I'm sure you're familiar with, has lots of greatest hits, including David and Goliath. Right? And in fact, when you think of David, you probably think of him pretty positively. He was known as a great leader and is even described as a man after God's own heart. But even with all those accolades, he still had his downfalls. The event we're looking at today took place during wartime in Israel's history with the Ammonite people. Right? This was one of Israel's biggest enemies. And during that time, when a nation went to war, it was normal for the kings to fight alongside their troops, or at least to go and lead his troops physically in person and run strategy and stuff for his army. It was just, he was with his people. That was the custom. But this time, David decided not to be like one of the other kings. In the spring of the year, when kings normally go out to war, David sent Joab and the Israelite army to fight the Ammonites. David was essentially like, nah, I'm good. You guys go have your fun. And that decision had consequences that would unfold later. By choosing to stay home, David was essentially sending his troops this message, that I want you to take care of the hard stuff, but I'm going to hang back at home. And that was just the beginning. While his army was at war, David was home and bored. This is like summer when schools are out and all your friends are busy and you're sitting at home all day long with nothing to do. Your hobbies have gotten old, your screen time has gone way too high, and you're starting to get a little bit stir crazy. And one of the things I've recognized in life is that idle hands find trouble. It's okay to be a little bored from time to time, even good for your creativity, but excessive time spent not working towards anything positive, playing video games, watching too much TV, etc., this will open the door for temptation. It's true for all of us, and it was true for David. So one afternoon, David is walking around on his rooftop of his palace, and this is where he could look out over all the city that he rules. And all of a sudden, he notices a beautiful woman bathing on her rooftop, which might seem weird to us because who has a bathtub on the rooftop? But back then, rainwater would gather on the rooftop, and it made a lot of sense. So anyway, David never should have been on his rooftop to begin with. The most dangerous place for you to be is any place that you should never have been in the first place. For most of us, when we get into trouble, it starts long before we actually do the thing that gets us into trouble. We make a series of decisions. We position ourselves in such a way that leads to trouble. And David wants to know more about this woman. It's obviously an abuse of power, but David is the king, and in that culture, the king gets what the king wants. And in this case, he wants her. The most dangerous person for you to be with is any person you should never have been with in the first place. He sends out his men to find out about her, and this was their report. She is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, and the wife of Uriah the Hittite. See, the messenger didn't just tell David her name, he made sure David knew Bathsheba was someone's daughter and someone's wife. In other words, I have an idea what it is that you want, but this is not a good idea. She isn't an object, she's a human being with a family, and she's not yours to have. Bad idea, David, walk away. But David didn't care about that. His judgment was clearly clouded by his desires or his hormones or whatever you want to call it, and he clearly wasn't thinking about what was right or honoring to other people. It's pretty easy to see that David made a few assumptions here. 1, I'm an exception to the rule. 2, what I want isn't that bad. And 3, I can deal with whatever happens as a result. Without any question, both as a human and as a leader, the king of God's chosen people, David abuses his power. He has Bathsheba, a married woman, brought to him. He has sex with her, and something she probably never wanted. There's some debate as to whether or not she knew who was watching as she bathed, but one thing is for certain, David definitely abused his authority as God's king. And from this sexual encounter, Bathsheba becomes pregnant. At every turn, David seems to think he's an exception to the rules, but he isn't. Far from it. David isn't above right and wrong. There are very real consequences when we make poor decisions. And David could have stopped, owned up to all his blatant selfishness and sin, and things would have probably not gotten any worse than they did. But of course he doesn't. His abuse of power continues, and things kept snowballing. David decides to call Uriah, Bathsheba's husband, home from war and try to get him to sleep with her. The thinking here is that if Uriah came home and slept with his wife, then everyone would say that the baby was Uriah's and not his. Now we're getting to like reality show territory, right? But when Uriah gets home, he doesn't feel like it's right to sleep in his own bed while his friends and fellow soldiers are out fighting a war. Right? This is an honor-shame culture, and that would have been dishonorable for him to do this. So he slept outside the palace instead. So David invites Uriah over for dinner, hoping to get him drunk so that he would go home and sleep with his wife. But nope, Uriah still won't go back to his house. And there's some pretty convincing scholarly debate as to the reality that Uriah probably knew what was up. The king was treating him uncharacteristically nice, almost like bribing him, and he wasn't about to bail David out. So now David is desperate to hide what he's done. He gives an order for Uriah to go back to war, but this time David wants Uriah stationed at the front lines, where the fighting was obviously the most dangerous. Because if David couldn't cover up Bathsheba's pregnancy, then Uriah had to be taken out of the picture completely. And that's exactly what happened. Uriah was killed, and afterward, David made Bathsheba one of his wives. Now, we listen to this story today and wonder, what was David thinking? Right? These are terrible decisions, and you aren't wrong. They are pretty terrible decisions. And while most of the attention does go on David, I want us to focus back here on the sobering reality that the value and respect and humanity of Bathsheba is diminished. Bathsheba and her way of life is sent into upheaval. The loss, the pain, the heartache, it all seems to become an aside in this story. And her story and her pain teaches us an invaluable lesson. There are probably times with any of us where what we want, what we think we need, completely clouds our need and capacity to value other people. Maybe you haven't been nearly as extreme as this story, but we're all capable of getting stuck in a storm because we created the weather. If we'd slowed down, gotten honest with ourselves, and even had a bit of perspective, then maybe things wouldn't have gone downhill so fast. But sometimes when the pressure is on, we lose perspective. We convince ourselves that we're the exception. I've heard that in church growing up, or I know I shouldn't do this, or I know I shouldn't do that, but those crazy, consequences are the extreme cases. I won't be one of those. I'm different. This is different. We lie to ourselves. We believe that we won't have regrets or get caught. We can turn it around and make it right. We won't turn out like everyone else. We have a relationship that others can't possibly understand. Right? And that's the kind of thing all people with messed up relationships say. We're in denial. And if we aren't careful, we can wind up making a load of bad decisions just like David. And without even realizing it, we don't even think that there's another person paying a very steep price for our own selfishness. Over and over again, David was asking, what can I get away with? How can I avoid the consequences? Every decision he made was through that perspective. And because he was the only person speaking into his own decisions, he did things that he knew he shouldn't just to get what he wanted. To such a degree that Bathsheba's value, well-being, and feelings seemed to never even be a consideration to him. Right? When we believe that we're the exception to the rule, or we feel like we can't be okay without a relationship, we can just end up justifying bad decisions or bad situations. We can tell ourselves that things are okay, and we know that they're not. And this is a temptation that we can all face. But the truth is this: the pressure to be with someone can cause you to settle for anything. We end up settling for situations, people, or relationships that aren't going to be the best for the other person, especially when the pressure we're under is self-imposed. And we cannot lose sight of this. Settling for anything can mean that all the while fading in the background is a person, someone with intrinsic value on the other side of our misplaced desire that we may be deeply hurting. So when it comes to dating, it helps to be honest with yourself and ask the right questions. Questions like, is there any area where you feel pressure to get something or to do something that you don't actually need? Is there any area where you find yourself thinking, that may be true for everyone else, but it's not going to be true for me or for us? Is there anything that makes you think you have things under control, even when everyone else is telling you differently? In other words, is there an area where you're settling for someone or something that you know you shouldn't? So you might be wondering, is this how the story ended? No. David recognized that he was wrong, but he didn't do it alone. It took someone else speaking up and David being willing to listen. Sometimes seeing things clearly can take someone being real and honest with us even when it isn't easy. But it also takes us being willing to listen. So this week, I want to encourage you to do 3 things. 1, find someone to speak into your dating life. This could be a wise friend, it could be your small group leader, it could be a trusted adult. Think about the people in your life who you trust, and then identify someone who will be completely real with you. Secondly, ask them to help you see areas where you're not honest with yourself or facing the truth in your life. This part isn't easy. It might even be scary. It isn't like you have to share every deepest, darkest secret to start, but you do have to start somewhere. And chances are they'll be able to see things just by knowing you. And third, listen to them. Even if you find someone you trust and they have all the wisest things to say, that wisdom is wasted if you won't listen. So make a decision to always give this person a chance to say what they see, to always be honest with you, even when, and especially when, it's something you may not want to hear. Because if you don't want to hear their thoughts on the situation, there's a pretty good chance that's actually exactly what you need to do. So let me ask you a few difficult questions. Do you have someone to help you gain perspective as it relates to your relationships? Someone who will ask the hard, uncomfortable questions? Are you being honest enough with yourself to let someone in who will help you reach the most potential in both your dating life and just your life in general? Are you perhaps manipulating a relationship for personal gain? Have you convinced yourself that, hey, this is no big deal? And this question is tough. Much like David, are you abusing your own power and popularity? Maybe you really need to let someone in. Being honest with yourself now will save you a lot of pain later. And I'm not talking like 10 years from now, although that's definitely true too. I'm saying it can save you a lot of regret and baggage just weeks or months from now. The reality is that all of us can end up a million places that we didn't want to by accident, all because we never asked tough questions and made difficult decisions. But to end up where you want to be in dating and relationships in your life, to see the potential in the person that you date, you need to be honest with yourself and someone else to be honest with you. Remember, the pressure to be with someone can cause you to settle for anything. And God doesn't want you to settle. He wants you to thrive. So as you guys turn to your small groups, you're going to finish this discussion, and then we'll be back for one more week in this series. All right, love you guys.